Hey guys, welcome back. I got some cool news to share with you. I was back in touch with Steve Albini this past week, and we've agreed to do a new interview together. That interview is tentatively scheduled for the beginning of spring, so keep an eye out for that one. In the meantime, I want to show you guys some previously unreleased footage, as well as some of the lesser-known footage from the interviews I've done in the past with various people who worked with Nirvana. These people are Steve Albini, Jack Endino, Alice Wheeler, and Charles Peterson. Part 1 of this video, working with Nirvana, has been doing well, so thank you guys for that. I want to show you guys now part 2. If you haven't already subscribed, make sure to do so. Lots of Nirvana-related videos here, as well as lots of videos about rock and roll in general. So if you guys like rock and roll, if you guys like Nirvana, make sure to subscribe. Everything I do here is original, so your support is sincerely appreciated. Thanks for watching, guys. Here's the video.
What was the effect on you personally when that music you were involved with just exploded?
Well, I felt like I was right in the middle of a sort of a little renaissance of rock that was going on here in Seattle. I was right in the engine room, as it were. And I don't think any of us expected that, 4 or 5 Seattle bands would suddenly be, up in the upper reaches of the Billboard album charts, by 1991, 1992. That was a big surprise. So nobody really expected that this music would start selling again like it did. And suddenly everybody wanted a rock band from Seattle. We had a little resurgence of rock music here in Seattle. And again, I was kind of right there in the middle of it when it started. But who knew that it would become a big part of the music industry?
I heard Nevermind before it was on the radio. Susie Tennant, who was doing A&R for Geffen and handling Nirvana, played it for me in her car one day, and then I heard it elsewhere, and it was only until I was in the local little kind of co-op grocery store, and I heard it on the radio. And even though it was probably the college station, maybe even, or whatever, but it was just something about, and it was a hippie grocery store, but still, there was something about hearing it in that environment. And then, of course, you started hearing it around, seeing on TV and reading about it everywhere. And so it did have that, it did have this kind of somewhat euphoric, but also somewhat numbing effect at the same time. And it also did bring in a lot of work. All of a sudden we were the hotbed of music, and everybody wanted the next Nirvana.
When Teen Spirit exploded, how did that change your life?
I was already doing pretty well on account of my, all the other records I'd done from the grunge era, meaning the Mudhoney records, the Tad records, the Soundgarden record. I was pretty well on my way with my career when Nevermind blew up, because I'd been doing it since 1986, and Nevermind didn't blow up really until about January of 1992, I think was when it hit the top of the charts. And for the most part, people went back and checked out Bleach at the time and said, well, this doesn't sound like Nevermind, But the people who were influenced by Mudhoney, they knew what I was doing. They wanted more of that rough, unproduced rock and roll sound that I was doing at the time. This was 30 years ago. The Bleach record has had somewhat of a reappraisal. It seems like more and more people have gone back, and they actually are surprised to find that they really like the record.
Some of my favorite Nirvana tracks, for example, are the ones that are not that well known. You know what I mean? Like,
oh yeah,
his old age acoustic demo.
I don't know if I know that one off the top of my head.
It's all good, but a lot of verse chorus.
Oh yeah,
right?
I think that's a B-side on one of the singles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and sometimes I enjoy the B-sides more than the A side.
Yeah, and see, when you knew Kurt and you knew all those people around that, a lot of people played experimental noise music. Part of why Kurt and Nirvana was so great was because he was a lonely kid, and he sat at home in his room and spent hour after hour after hour playing guitar and writing all those notes. And then also when he moved to Olympia and lived with Tracy, he hung out with all his kids in college. So we all sat around and talked about the meaning of life and talked about art and creativity. And see, that's the thing about the punk scene, is everybody knew each other. You know, you might not know that person specifically, but it was so small, like in the 80s and 90s, that if you didn't know somebody, you knew somebody from that town, or you knew somebody that knew somebody from that town. We didn't care about what the mainstream was telling us. We didn't believe in that anymore because it was all fake.
Like, I like Nirvana, I like Pink Floyd, I like The Doors, because if you listen to that music, there's a story there. They're talking about their emotions and their feelings, and I feel like today with everything, it's just, look at my car, look at this. It's like, that's it. That's all you hear on the radio.
Yeah.
And it's just like, I can't relate to that, you know?
Everything has become an advertising sales pitch, and you know, that's even the way that people approach art now. And for me personally, in my art, it drives me crazy, because it's like they want you to synopsize what you're doing in 5 seconds. Well, it's like sometimes art takes a while to like get to the point, you know. It's like you should be able to work through it, like spend a few years working on it if it's something that's important to you.
I came up through the underground music scene, through the punk rock scene, and I and my peers in that scene never considered any kind of a professional relationship with music. Like, we were doing music because it was the most exciting thing that we were involved in, and that's how we wanted to spend our time. No one, literally no one, thought that it was a career or that it was a way to make a living, right? So the pressures that we put on ourselves were all self-imposed. Like, you wanted to be awesome. You wanted to make records that were great. You wanted to put on shows that freaked people out, you know? And then, like, the notion of being a professional musician never crossed anybody's mind. As the underground music scene grew, and in the post-punk era, some of the bands that started in that idiom started to achieve some measure of sort of broader cultural acceptance or mainstream success. Then that was when the first interactions with the mainstream music business happened. You had bands like Sonic Youth and Husker Du and the Replacements, who had cut their teeth in the sort of grubby punk rock and underground music scene, but had sort of graduated into a mainstream presence and had been signed to big record labels and were now part of the mainstream music business. And then there was a second generation of those bands that were sort of inspired by that to like have professional aspirations, as it were. And that sort of culminated with Nirvana becoming the biggest band in the world. And that sort of started a feeding frenzy with the big record labels, where the big record labels were trying to find other like unpolished gems in the underground music scene that they could turn into commodities like that. So the premise that the music business is hard now and it used to be easier rings funny in my ears, because I never once considered it a business. I considered it an artistic enterprise and something that my friends and I cherished as a function of our identity as people who were outside society's norms and outside the conventional career paths.
I think that the musicians from this scene were pretty true to themselves for the most part. I think there are kids making this same music right now, though. I mean, I've seen it in a backyard up the street here a couple summers ago. Everything percolates underground, and it comes back up.
Do you think we can get to a point where rock and roll starts to rise again?
It could be. I don't know what it is. Like, where's the new Clash? Where's the new Nirvana?
I've heard rumors that you were considered to work on In Utero. Is this true?
You know, there were rumors of it reaching me, because I know Kurt had talked about wanting to go back to a less produced sound. You know, after Nevermind, I think he wanted something that was a little less slick and less commercial sounding, because of the nature of the production and mastering on that record was very radio friendly, which was a little of a shock to the band, I think. And, you know, there were rumors about it, but I never heard anything directly from the band. And in fact, the first time I talked to Kurt about it, he told me that he was planning on recording with Steve Albini. So I thought, well, that puts that to rest. But I did end up doing some demos for In Utero. You know, they came and said they wanted to record on the 8-track machine and try and just bang some songs out. And unfortunately, we did 6 or 7 songs, and Kurt only did vocals on one of them.
Do you remember which song that was?
It was "Rape Me," and it's on the box set, actually. And the other stuff we did is instrumental, and most of that got released as part of one of the In Utero deluxe reissue packages. I think it's the CD version. Has got some of those instrumental demos, you know, tacked onto the end with some other miscellaneous odds and ends. But no, I mean, the first time I heard about it, it was Kurt telling me they were going to record with Steve Albini. So, you know, that put the rumors to rest for me right away. And I wasn't expecting they would do it with me. They'd already made a record with me.
My background is from the punk underground. Things like competence and virtuosity were not prized. Like it wasn't that you necessarily needed to be ashamed of being good at your instrument, but the mode of expression, that is like being a shredder or being, you know, like a Wicked Chops drummer, that was much, much less important than what you were trying to express and what you were trying to do. A lot of my favorite bands were formed by neophytes with no experience playing music, and they used their creative minds to fashion a vocabulary that they could use themselves to express themselves. And it didn't necessarily map or correspond with what you would be taught by a guitar instructor or what the traditions of music would have valued up to that point.
But there wasn't like a right or a wrong to it. Whatever you did that you liked yourself was what was right. And the more you liked it, the more confident you were, and therefore the more other people liked it. You know, now it's about the superficial. You know, and I'm not saying everything is that way. It's just harder to find anything that's not, because there's so much out there. But when you try to go through all the different music, it's like I want to like new stuff, and I do. I find stuff I like all the time. But a lot of the stuff I watch is really like, I'm like horrified by it. What I've noticed recently with, because I worked with a bunch of younger people recently, and a lot of them are in bands, and some of them have the attitude of, we learned a song, we made a video, it's on YouTube, now we're rock stars. You know, it's like, wait, you barely even can play that song. So I think they're getting a different kind of attention. Like, by doing the instant gratification video, then they get everyone in their own peer group to like them, and maybe people with that mindset. But if they're trying to impress other people outside of their specific peer group, they would do better to make something that had more of a complete vision in it. And I think that kind of art and music takes time. You have to remember, like, in the 80s and 90s, it wasn't that cool to be a musician and artist. It was thought of that you were like maybe the scum of the earth, or there might be something wrong with you, or you might have mental health issues, you know, if you were doing that, or something that was negative. You know, I think the way since like the year 2000, the internet has changed everything. In society now, it's all about the image and the sales pitch. And a lot of art now, you read the description of it and you think, oh, this sounds like a good art show, I want to go see it. And then you go see it and you find out that the person has spent more time writing the description or the sales pitch for the art show than actually making the works of art that they put up on the wall. And it's so disappointing because it doesn't really have that genuine feel. And it has a feel like an advertising sales pitch instead, you know? And so it's like, I want you to show me your art. I want to see your art and see, like, have it move me and have it make me feel something and show me something new that I don't know about, like something that you care about, you know, that is different from what I care about, but might also be similar to what I care about and might relate to me somehow. But I think now it's like more about the surface image. And, you know, I think that is like the death of like really top creativity.
Every musician that I knew that was a peer of mine, that was a friend of mine, that I admired, the people who were my heroes and my inspiration, they all had day jobs. Every one of them, right? that there was a brief period where some of those people could be professional musicians and nothing else was an anomaly. And it struck me then as an anomaly, like, this is freakish, this can't go on forever, you know. So when that feeding frenzy died down and all of the bands that were plucked from the underground into the mainstream, like, very few of those had any measure of success in the mainstream. And the mainstream music business kind of reverted back to form, which was making sort of manufactured pop music.
I always like to talk about how Nirvana and the grunge movement was the last big music movement pre-internet, kind of the digital information age. You know, everything suddenly just centralized instead of, like, it took a lot of the kind of the mystery out of it.
After around the year 2000, and now this is I have to point this out.
Sure.
I had made, probably a couple hundred records already by the time the year 2000 came about, and 97% of everything I recorded, period, everything, got released by some indie label somewhere during that period. Sometimes years later, sometimes it was records that didn't get released at the time, but somebody would come along and go, "Oh, this is historically interesting. We're going to put this out." So seriously, almost everything I touched for 10 years got released by an indie label somewhere. It was all indie work for me and work in other countries for major labels, which was ironic. But my point is, the indie labels kind of dried up after the turn of the century. And yet I'm just as busy recording now as I ever was, if not more so. But people just put records out themselves.
How did you get into the business? Did, for example, Skin Yard come before engineering? Like, what was your story?
My story was I started recording even before I was really a serious musician. Right from the first time I was, playing in a band. It wasn't even a band. I was basically jamming with some friends. I was a drummer. That was my first instrument that I had any competency on. And almost from day one, I would set up a pair of microphones going into a little cassette deck I had that had 2 microphone inputs on it. And I would record every jam, because if you didn't have a recording, you didn't have any proof that you had actually played music if there wasn't a recording of it. I had to have proof that I was actually maybe possibly becoming a musician. So it was extremely interesting to me to listen back to what I was doing while I was jamming with my friends in a garage on Bainbridge Island. It was terrible music, of course, but the point was it existed, it was music, and we were actually playing it. And I thought, well, God, I sound kind of like a drummer. Maybe I could do this musician thing. But at the same time, I was recording right from day one. I was always, whenever I was playing music, the red light was always on, as we used to say. I was used to always having some recording thing going on, whether it's just a mic hanging from the wall, anything. And as soon as I got 2 cassette decks, I started bouncing tracks back and forth between the 2 cassette decks, using a Y cable to combine things, 2 channels into one. And so I guess I was interested in recording. The two things happened at the same time for me: becoming a musician, switching to bass, becoming a guitar player. All the while I was recording constantly. By the time I had a chance to buy a 4-track reel-to-reel machine, it was a Tascam. A TIAC. A TIAC 3340S 4-track that I picked up in 1980. That was like the greatest thing in the world to me, because I didn't have to bounce tracks anymore. And I got a little 6-channel mixing board and a couple of microphones and, set up in my basement where, I was jamming with people, and it was suddenly I had a little studio. And when Skin Yard started a few years later, I would record every practice, just in case something unintentionally brilliant came about, I would have a record of it. And that's actually how we wrote a lot of songs.
Really?
Because I would have, we would just start jamming on something and I'd say, wait, that riff there, we got to record that, and then later we'd come back to it. You know, because it's if you didn't record it at the time, you would just forget it. It would be gone.
Yeah. And were you guys officially Skinyard at that point, or were you still friends jamming with each other?
The band started. We didn't have a band name for the first few months, but our first jam. My first jam with Daniel House on bass, and we had actually a drummer named Greg Gilmore at the time. He only was with us for a short time. But that was, I think, New Year's Day of 1985 was the first rehearsal of what would become Skinyard, actually. And we didn't get our singer, Ben McMillan, until a couple months later. Matt Cameron joined the band as a drummer, I think, in late February of 1985. And I think we played our first gig as Skinyard. It was May or June of 1985. I can't really remember right now. There's a website that has all the chronology on it. But I was recording the whole time. I didn't actually start working in a real studio until summer of 1986, which was Reciprocal Recording, that our friend Chris Hanzik had opened the studio. And I said, hey, not only have I been recording in my basement for a long time, but I know a lot of musicians, I'll bring them into your studio. Let me work at your studio. And he's great.
Why did you guys close that down, if I may ask?
It outgrew the space. The building is not very big. And when the studio started, it was mainly Chris and myself doing the engineering. And when the studio started, it was an 8-track setup. And then we got really busy, and Chris had the money to buy a 16-track. And that got busy, and then we got a 24-track machine. But the studio wasn't very big. The building wasn't a particularly great building. The control room was too small. It just was not, and in my opinion, never was a really ideal building to put a studio in. It was a good location. There were no neighbors. You had no problem with noise complaints. Well, I had one once, but it was a funky old building that didn't really have any other purpose other than a recording studio. It was literally triangular shaped. But Chris felt it was time to move on from that space, and eventually he found another building, and he ran it as Hanzik Audio for over a decade, I think. And now he's moved out of Seattle, and he mostly just does mastering. HanzikAV.com. I still send him things if I don't feel like mastering something, or maybe I've mixed it and I'd rather have someone more objective do the mastering. I always send it to Chris. He's been mastering longer than anybody here in Seattle. But I do a lot of mastering myself now, too.
How did you end up becoming the grunge guy, so to speak?
How did I end up becoming the grunge guy? Well, how did we end up becoming grunge? I mean, it all just sort of like, we were all interested in music, and, some of us couldn't play it, so we did photography, and then there were others who did the graphic design and art, and of course Bruce and John, who knew business a little bit and wanted to run a label, and so of Sub Pop. So at first it was just we created our own industry here to a degree, because we were separated from the industries of New York and LA and elsewhere. So Sub Pop at one point did the brilliant thing of flying in an English journalist to then write this huge piece, which of course then if people like, oh my God, well they're writing about him in England, let's check it out, So it just kind of steamrolled that way. It was a very organic process.
Here in Seattle, I don't know what's going to come in the door here at the studio next. It could be anything. It could be garage, it could be punk, it could be psych, or it could be metal. None of them are at the top of the charts. None of them are on commercial radio. KEXP might play some of it, though.
Is that why, do you think perhaps people are saying rock is dead because of this kind of scenario?
Yeah, it's been driven back underground economically again. You go into a bank and you hear what they're playing over the speakers. It's usually some sort of processed pop music. I can hear the auto-tune very clearly. When I walk into the bank, they're always playing some commercial AM station or something, and yeah, you can hear the auto-tune, you can hear the drum machine. I can hear the fact that it was all done on a grid. And it's a completely alien aesthetic from the way I make recordings. I've been to Brazil several times. I've been to Chile many times. I've been to Argentina. And what seems to have been in common is that all these countries had military dictatorships that started winding down around the middle of the 80s or the late 80s. And these were kind of controlled societies where, the music that was available to them on its digital commercial radio, it's of course coming from the internet, was kind of controlled. All you could hear was the safe stuff, the culturally approved local pop music and maybe, your Beatles and Stones and some classic rock and that sort of thing. And when these various dictatorships fell, the young people suddenly had the whole history of pop, the whole history of rock and roll suddenly was available to them. And like, for instance, in Chile, when Pinochet fell, I was told this by a young Chileno. Some of the first music they heard was the Seattle music that I was doing here, like Nirvana, Mudhoney, that sort of thing. And it made a big impression on them. It was sort of the sound of freedom, if you will, which sounds really corny, but that was the words that were used when this was described to me. So they love their rock and roll in South America because it's the sound of dictatorships falling, really, in a lot of ways. It still has a sort of a revolutionary kind of association to it because during the dictatorships, you could be thrown in jail for being in a rock band. That was considered subversive, and it wasn't something, you wanted to risk. So there was a lot of danger associated with playing rock and roll during the dictatorships. So the South Americans have a real appreciation for rock.
The kids that I meet that love Kurt, I love them because a lot of them are really beautiful kids. Like I have a lot of photos in my book of kids that I've met.
I saw that one kid who's like a big Nirvana fan. He kind of lives in a tent on a hill or something. That's my friend James, and he is from, I want to say North Carolina. It could be South Carolina, but I think it's North Carolina. One of the Carolinas.
And he was in a band, and he and his then girlfriend, who's now his wife, and their best friend came here in their old beat-up car because he loved Kurt so much. And I was working at the Seattle Weekly shooting news photographs, and that was the first tent city. So it was the first camp for homeless people here in Seattle. And anyway, they sent me out to photograph Tent City, and I met James. I was excited because he had a Nirvana t-shirt on, but it wasn't like he'd made it himself.
Oh, that's so cool.
And so I started talking to him about Nirvana, and he started talking about Nirvana. And so I made friends with him, and then after I was done with the shoot, I went away and turned in my photo and everything, and then I decided to go back and visit him and his friend and his girlfriend, and they were in the tent, and I said, I want to come back and take photos of you. And then there was like a barbecue area because they were camped in a park on Beacon Hill, and there was that scenic view, right? Yeah. With I think it's the King Dome still in that picture, isn't it?
Maybe, I don't remember.
I'll have to look and see. But anyways, I think it's the King Dome before they tore down the old stadium. And it just was really scenic, so I wanted to come back and take photos of him because in some ways he looks a lot like Kurt Cobain. Like, I totally made him look like Kurt Cobain in the photograph.
And that kind of thing, right?
No, he doesn't have a wig.
Oh,
it's just his hair. Like, it's bleached out. Like, he's like an 18-year-old kid. Physically, in person, he's like nothing like Kurt. He's like much taller and much larger person than Kurt was.
That's funny.
But he just was channeling Kurt because he loved Kurt so much. And they drove out to Aberdeen. They used their last pennies to get out to Aberdeen and check it out, right? And then he came back to Seattle, and then they ended up at the homeless camp. Then they got jobs, and then they stayed around here for a couple of years, like maybe a year and a half or something like that, and kind of had their Nirvana adventure and stuff. And then they went back and got married, and now they have 2 daughters.
That's amazing.
And live there. And he's in a band called Mary Tree now. And they toured out here. I think it was not last summer. But yeah, and then I always meet these kids that love Nirvana and love Kurt that are really sensitive. And I'm sensitive, so I probably just attract those kind of people. It's hard like when you get older and there's a lot of pressure, you know, to be something that you're not when you're younger. Except for maybe now the internet's made so much pressure on people to be something when you're young. Before you used to have sort of a pass for a while, you know, at least into your 30s, maybe even into your 40s, you know, and you could still be okay, you know, because some people are late bloomers, so it's okay, you know. Not everybody has to be perfect, and, you know, I mean, a lot of sensitive people don't even find themselves until they get older and kind of understand how their emotions work and, like, figure things out and are able to, you know, survive and thrive and find people that are good to them instead of people that pick on them and beat them up. A lot of people that you meet like that are more insecure than ever because they have to make sure no one ever sees their humanity or their flaws or their imperfections. And to me, that's what I love about people, are their imperfections. I mean, in my photography, that's what I look for, is that shared humanity, you know, because that is our human imperfections, and to me, that's what I care about.
This is a Latin Grammy, so that's what these things look like. And
That's amazing.
you know, the funny thing is,
No way, they come
comes,
off.
Yeah, it comes apart.
Is that the same
You're not
with...
supposed to do that. I don't
Wow,
think.
that's funny.
Yeah, it is funny. I'm an engineer. I take things apart and then I put them together again.
Did you learn that by accident? Or
I did, actually. The thing just came unscrewed one day. You know, so yeah, there it is. So who knew? You know, initially was known as a grunge guy, gets a Grammy for a Brazilian pop record. A Brazilian record that I did for an artist named Nando Reis. He was the bass player for Titãs for many years, and then he went solo in around 2001, 2002, and has had, I made 4 albums with the band Titãs when Nando was in the band, and then I've worked on 3 or 4 of his solo albums, and this was for a record that I made called Jardim Pomar a couple of years ago. I think it's dated 2017, and I was the co-producer with Barrett Martin, and I also mixed the record, and in fact I played some guitar on the record as well. The very first note you hear on the first song of the record is my guitar.
Really?
And the record did very, very well in Brazil, and hence my Grammy.
That's
for
amazing.
Being the Produtor e Engenheiro.
Can you read that at all?
Academia Latina de Arts e Sciences de Gravação. Gravação, actually. See, I've been in Spanish-speaking countries for a while lately, and so my Portuguese accent is a little bit corrupted now.
Do you prefer Spanish or Portuguese?
I learned a lot of Portuguese I spent a lot of time in Brazil, and I almost got to the point where I could speak Portuguese. And it now affects me when I try and speak Spanish. Half the time it comes out Portuguese and just becomes a huge comedy. I'm sure my Spanish-speaking friends are really tired of hearing about it.
That's funny.
But Jack Endino, Produtor e Engenheiro, Melhor Álbum de Rock ou de Música Alternativa em Língua Portuguesa 2017, or for Jardim Pomar by the artist Nando Reis.